I thought I had the perfect life, until I uncovered the lies, betrayal, and manipulation hiding right under my nose. What followed was a journey of heartbreak, revenge, and redemption that would change everything, and expose secrets no one saw coming. I grew up in a small Texas town where the phrase, "everybody knows everybody," was more than just a saying, it was a way of life. My father worked as a translator for the U.S. Embassy, so my childhood was rich with stories about exotic lands and different languages. When I turned 18, my family moved to England because of his job, and that's where I began my college journey. During my years at Oxford, I dove deeply into computer technology, business management, and economics, excelling in the demanding academic environment. Along the way, I built enduring friendships, particularly with my younger sister, Patricia, or Pat, as I like to call her. After earning my degrees, I came back to the United States, eager to make my own mark on the world. My name is Dan Colton, and before I explain how things unraveled, it's important to introduce you to my ex-wife, Emily. Fitness has always been part of who I am. Whenever I can, I start my mornings with 2 laps around the park. At 5 feet 10 inches and 180 pounds, most of it muscle, I maintain my fitness through swimming several miles weekly and lifting weights twice a week at a classic gym. I even mix in MMA sessions, not enough to call myself an expert, but enough to be capable. People often tell me I bear a resemblance to George Clooney, though I credit that to my father's genetics more than anything else. While my academic background is extensive, a master's in computer technology, a postgraduate degree in business management, and a bachelor's in economics from Oxford, it's just part of my story. My father returned to the U.S. while I finished my education and began a career as a computer repair technician. As for me, I now lead a well-regarded company, overseeing the development of a cutting-edge program with applications in gaming and military technology. Its ability to respond in real time is groundbreaking, and we're aiming for it to launch within the year. My sister, Pat, is more than family, she's my closest confidant. We've always been open with each other, never keeping secrets. She's 2 years younger and currently working as a junior partner at a top-tier law firm in New York City. Now, let me tell you about Emily. She's a woman who turns heads wherever she goes. At 5 feet 3 inches, with a slender, athletic build, she works out 4 times a week to maintain her figure. Her fiery red hair and emerald green eyes are unforgettable, and her radiant smile can light up any room. Beneath her stunning appearance is a fierce corporate attorney at XYZ, a leading PR and advertising agency where she's built an impressive career. We met at a pivotal moment, Pat's college graduation. Pat, Emily's sister, and their friend Amy had been roommates, and they introduced us at the celebration. As fate would have it, Emily and I discovered we lived just 3 miles apart in the same mid-sized Texas town, Freestone. 6 months later, we started dating, and within another 6 months, we were married. After we said, "I do," Emily began working at XYZ as a junior attorney, earning a modest salary with occasional bonuses. I, meanwhile, had a role at ABC Flight Controllers, specializing in assembling and deconstructing software code for a mid-5-figure income. Together, we bought a cozy 3-bedroom house and began building a life that, at the time, felt full of potential. The house I inherited from my grandparents was in a great neighborhood, providing us with a solid foundation as we started our lives together. My sister, Pat, received a lump sum inheritance, which gave her a financial boost, while Emily's family, her sister and parents, remained in New York. Meanwhile, my own parents had retired to sunny Florida. Twice a year, we made it a tradition to host family gatherings for Thanksgiving and Christmas, rotating locations between us. Life was good, and we were content. Our modest but steady income supported nice cars and allowed us to take 2 vacations each year. 2 years into our marriage, Emily's career took off. She was promoted to junior partner, a significant milestone that marked the beginning of some changes. She started going out with her friends more often, particularly on Friday nights, and her late nights at the office became more frequent. I tried to brush it off at first, convincing myself it was just the nature of her high-powered career. But over time, a nagging feeling started to grow. Suspicion crept into my thoughts. Although I hated myself for it, I began monitoring her behavior. I'd read through her emails, checked her laundry for anything unusual, and even installed a keylogger on her laptop. Deep down, I knew this wasn't healthy, and I felt paranoid. Yet, something in my gut told me I wasn't completely off base. One evening, I even followed her after work. Nothing inappropriate happened, she didn't dance with other men, or even engage in anything remotely suspicious. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right in our marriage. Emily had her own vision for the future. She wanted to become a senior partner before starting a family, which she estimated would take another 5 years. She was laser-focused on her career and seemed happy with her trajectory. Meanwhile, I was feeling increasingly stuck in mine. The company I worked for was family-owned, and promotions were reserved exclusively for relatives, regardless of their qualifications. It became clear to me that my professional growth was at a dead end. After a lot of reflection, I decided it was time to make a bold move and start my own computer repair business. But this wasn't going to be a standard shop where people dropped off their laptops for repairs. Instead, I envisioned a business catering to companies in need of advanced security systems and large-scale system upgrades. I conducted a detailed business analysis, expecting slow initial growth, but I was confident that within a year, I'd be earning more than I ever had before. When I sat down with Emily to share my plans, I explained the challenges of the first year and emphasized the long-term benefits. To keep things simple, I left out the details of the new software I was developing. Her reaction was far from supportive. She questioned why I would jeopardize our financial stability when things were going well, at least from her perspective. Emily was thriving in her career, while I felt like I was sinking in mine. Our financial arrangement had always been straightforward. We maintained separate accounts, only pooling money into a joint account to cover household expenses, to which we contributed equally. The rest we kept as personal savings. Determined to move forward, I quit my job and launched my business. To fund the venture, I relied on my savings and took out a loan against my house. I rented a modest workshop with an attached office and got to work, advertising my services and making cold calls to potential clients. Within 3 months, I started to see progress. I was content simply breaking even with my new business, though I could see it slowly gaining momentum. Meanwhile, my work on the new software was coming along smoothly, bringing a sense of fulfillment I hadn't felt in years. Then, one evening, Emily dropped a bombshell. She was 3 months pregnant, and we were expecting twins. At first, I was stunned. Then a darker thought crept into my mind, one that I couldn't shake. Paranoia began eating away at me. I started mentally retracing Emily's steps over the past few months. I remembered she had traveled to Miami for a business trip about 3 months prior. The timing gnawed at me. Could she have been unfaithful? The suspicion became too much to bear, and I resolved to get a DNA test. From the moment Emily learned she was pregnant, something in her demeanor shifted. She became distant, cold, and withdrew all affection. She insisted on abstaining from any intimacy, claiming she was worried about harming the babies. Both I and the doctor reassured her she was overreacting, but she wouldn't budge. Despite the growing tension between us, I tried to do my part. I accompanied her to relaxation classes, massaged her swollen feet every evening, rubbed oil on her belly to prevent stretch marks, and endured her increasingly irritable moods. Through it all, my business continued to grow. I hired Greg, a young and eager computer technician, and brought on May as the receptionist. Emily, however, showed no interest in my work, and I stopped trying to involve her. Then the big day arrived. I was in the middle of a meeting with a client, discussing a server upgrade, when I received the call. Emily had gone into labor. My client congratulated me and encouraged me to leave immediately. I rushed to the hospital, grabbing Emily's go bag and the DNA kit on my way out. When I arrived, she was already in a private room in the prenatal ward. After the doctor's examination, Emily was moved to the recovery unit to rest, and the hospital staff suggested I go home for the night. The next morning, I was on cloud 9, calling everyone to share the good news. The grandparents were ecstatic, eagerly planning visits to meet their new grandchildren. Pat and Amy promised to arrange time off to see their niece and nephew. On my way back to the hospital, I dropped off the DNA kit for processing. The staff informed me it would take about 10 days to get the results. Emily would need to stay at the hospital for a while, as she had experienced significant tearing during delivery. I brought her flowers and tried to make her comfortable. But the joy was short-lived. That morning, hospital staff returned with unexpected news. It seems Emily left the hospital willingly with another man, they explained. We know his identity, but we can't disclose it. Stunned, I could barely process what they were telling me. What am I supposed to do now? I asked, my voice trembling. Go home, Mr. Colton, they advised. We'll be in touch. I drove home, my mind racing, sick with worry and disbelief. How could Emily have done this, especially now? By 6 o'clock that evening, the detectives from the hospital appeared at my door. Their expressions were grim, and neither would meet my gaze. What's going on? I demanded. The woman spoke first. Mr. Colton, we can't tell you where your wife is right now. I cut her off, my frustration boiling over. Listen, I don't want excuses. Just call Emily and tell her to get back to me. I can't believe she'd act like this. Their response left me even more confused and anxious, but they didn't stay long. By lunchtime the next day, the reality of Emily's betrayal began to sink in. The future I had envisioned for us was unraveling before my eyes. Feeling restless and weighed down by the chaos of recent days, I decided to step out for some comfort food. I found myself at a Denny's, indulging in a mega burger with a side of fries, onion rings, and a cold beer. It wasn't exactly healthy, but it was what I needed in that moment. The meal offered some temporary relief, and afterward, I headed back home to the quiet solitude of my house. Once inside, I checked the answering machine, nothing. The silence only deepened the emptiness I felt. I turned on the TV, hoping to distract myself, but my mind kept replaying the whirlwind of events that had turned my life upside down. Sleep wouldn't come easily that night. By midnight, I gave up trying and finally crawled into bed, though my thoughts refused to let me rest. By 6 o'clock the next morning, I was up, unable to stay still. The ache of betrayal and the weight of uncertainty gnawed at me. I tried to focus on the day ahead, but my mind was pulled back to Emily's shocking revelation and the outrageous proposal that followed. It was Jimmy, her new partner, who had come to me days earlier, suggesting a financial deal in exchange for my kids. I remember jumping out of my chair so abruptly that I nearly toppled over the desk. Absolutely not. I shouted, my voice ringing with anger. My kids are not for sale, at any price. You can have that strumpet for free because I don't want anything to do with her. Emily, standing off to the side, tried to mediate with a soft voice. Dan, please, calm down. I know I've hurt you, and I am so sorry. This isn't how I wanted things to happen. She looked at me with pleading eyes. Jimmy and I have been seeing each other for a while now. We're serious. He wants to marry me and adopt the kids. He can't have children of his own. Her words trailed off as I glared at her, the sting of her betrayal cutting deeper with every syllable. I stormed out before I could say something I'd regret, driving aimlessly until I ended up back at Denny's. I ordered dinner and sat there, the food barely registering. When I finally made it home, the house felt colder and emptier than ever. I nursed a beer, staring blankly at the TV, furious with myself for even letting her through the door that day. Later that night, I woke to a pounding on the front door. Disoriented, I stumbled to answer it without checking the peephole, a mistake I would soon regret. The door flew open with such force that I staggered backward but managed to stay on my feet. Before I could react, 3 men stormed in, grabbing at me. Fully awake now, I struck one of them hard in the throat with extended knuckles. But then everything went dark. When I regained consciousness, the room was bathed in bright sunlight. My body ached all over, and it took a moment to register where I was. A woman was seated nearby, her face familiar. It was Cam, the wife of my MMA instructor, Nick Wright. My attempt to speak came out as a dry croak. Cam noticed and pressed the call button for a nurse. The nurse entered, checked my vitals, and handed me an ice chip. It felt like the best thing I'd ever tasted, better than the finest scotch. Cam explained how officers had found Nick's number in my phone under ICE, in case of emergency. Either Nick or Cam had been by my side ever since. Nick later filled me in on my injuries: a fractured tibia, shattered radius, 2 cracked ribs, a perforated lung, a damaged kidney, a cracked eye socket, and a broken nose. Other than that, you're fine, he joked, managing to coax a smile from me. After they left to go home and rest, a detective named Graham Cole arrived to ask about the attack. I recounted the parts one remembered, and he assured me they were making progress with the investigation. Later that evening, Nick returned with some mail. Among the pile was the DNA test I had submitted days earlier. I opened the envelope with trembling hands, bracing myself for the results. As I read the report, a wave of rage washed over me, quickly replaced by bitter laughter. Neither of the children was mine. Emily had been deceiving not only me but also Jimmy, a cheater caught in her own tangled web. Once I managed to stop laughing, I explained the DNA results and the situation to Nick. His expression turned pale as the reality sank in. He muttered something about needing to sit down, visibly shaken. A few days later, my attorney, Grace, presented a revised settlement agreement. "Here it is," she announced, sliding the documents across the table to Emily and Jimmy's attorney. Copies were provided to each of them as well. Jimmy squinted at the paperwork before his jaw tightened. "This is nothing like the offer we proposed," he snapped. "Allow me to walk you through it," Grace replied coolly. "Dan will retain full ownership of his house, including all its furnishings, his business, his savings, both vehicles, and any of Emily's jewelry currently in his possession. Additionally, Emily will deposit the $188,000 from her secret marital credit account into our holding account as part of the agreement." Emily's face flushed crimson, her composure slipping. You can't take that money." "It's mine," she sputtered, a vein on her forehead visibly pulsing. Jimmy intervened, his voice rising. "Look, we're not here to take everything you own, Dan. All we're asking for is 20%. "Excuse me?" I said, arching a brow. "Did you just say 20%? "Yes, 20%, Jimmy barked, crossing his arms. "I heard you," I said, keeping my voice calm. "But do you even understand what that means? Is this just a number you conjured up to support your ridiculous demands?" Jimmy smirked. "I don't need to justify it. Your attorney will tell you we're being reasonable." "No," I said firmly. "I did my research, thoroughly. I reviewed your company's publicly available information, including client lists, revenue reports, and valuation. Your company is publicly traded, so all this data is accessible online. What you're asking for is absurd." Grace added, "Jimmy, I suggest you consider how this agreement, or lack thereof, might impact your father's congressional campaign. The optics won't do you any favors." Later that evening, back in my hospital room, Grace couldn't resist asking why I had agreed to let Jimmy adopt the twins. "It just doesn't seem like you," she said, her tone curious. Wordlessly, I handed her the DNA results. Her eyes widened, and she burst into laughter. "You clever devil. They aren't yours, are they?" "Not biologically," I replied. "This proves she's been cheating on both of us." I plan to make sure Jimmy knows. Grace leaned back, a sly smile on her face. Dan, I'd hate to be on your bad side. You would have made a fantastic attorney. Thanks, I said with a shrug. But I don't have that killer instinct you do. She grinned. You just haven't learned to use it yet. The next morning, the doctor informed me I was cleared to go home. Nick and Cam stopped by to help me settle in. As we chatted, Nick hesitated for a moment before bringing up his son Eric, who had recently graduated with an engineering degree. Eric was getting married and needed a place to live. Would you consider renting your house to him? Nick asked cautiously. Without hesitation, I agreed. Set the rent based on what they can afford, and use the money to start a college fund for their future child, I said. Cam hugged me so tightly I thought she might re-injure my ribs. The next day, I called Pat to update her on everything. That evening, she and her friend Amy joined me for dinner. As the night went on, Pat teased me mercilessly about the way Amy and I seemed to click. You two make such a cute couple, Pat said with a mischievous grin, while Amy blushed. Flustered, I excused myself and retreated to the restroom. When I returned, the three of us continued chatting and laughing, though I made a point to avoid slow dances later in the evening. At the end of the night, we helped Amy into a cab before calling one for ourselves. Back at home, Pat couldn't resist ribbing me again, brushing off my protests with a laugh. The next day, we went house hunting. I envisioned a place with a backyard, perfect for barbecues and hosting friends, an ideal space for starting fresh. Amy continued to cross my mind. We weren't quite more than friends, but something was definitely growing between us. One evening, Pat and Amy planned to attend the theater together, but Pat canceled at the last minute, leaving just the two of us. During the taming of the shrew, Amy unexpectedly reached over and took my hand. It caught me off guard, as the most affection we'd ever shared was a friendly cheek kiss. After the play, we took a cab back to her apartment. She invited me inside, and before I could call for another cab, it drove away, leaving me with a decision I wasn't ready for. I cursed under my breath, realizing there wouldn't be another cab this far out of town. Amy, noticing my frustration, laughed softly. Then you'd better stay the night, she teased, a playful glint in her eyes. That night marked a turning point for us. We started spending more time together, and it became clear to everyone around us, especially Pat, that Amy and I just fit. Pat frequently commented on how happy she was to see me smiling again, and it was hard to deny how much brighter life felt with Amy by my side. During this time, I threw myself into completing my long-running project. The program I had been developing was finally ready, and its flexibility was its greatest strength. The hardware and software could be tailored for a variety of industries: military operations, gaming, aviation, and automotive systems. Knowing that gamers' relentless attention to detail would reveal any potential flaws, I decided to approach a top game developer to begin testing. When I first reached out to the gaming company, they were skeptical. They believed their existing systems were cutting edge and saw little room for improvement. But after seeing a live demonstration, their attitude shifted. The adaptability and power of my design spoke for itself, and they quickly moved from skeptics to collaborators. The project's success led to unexpected financial rewards. Licensing deals and partnerships brought in significant wealth, and I sought investment advice to manage it responsibly. Even with conservative options, basic interest alone would generate over $12 million annually before taxes. It was a dizzying leap from where I had been a year ago. Meanwhile, life around me was changing too. My sister had moved into a new rental apartment and was dating another attorney. Amy and I, growing more serious by the day, decided to move in together. Life felt stable, and for the first time in a long while, I was genuinely happy. But I hadn't forgotten the betrayal that had thrown my life into chaos. A year after starting fresh, I decided it was time to settle old scores. One evening, as we shared a quiet moment over dinner, I turned to Amy and said, "I still want to get back at your sister. Are you okay with that?" Amy didn't hesitate. With a mischievous grin, she replied, "Burn the witch. I'll help if you need me." We didn't have to wait long for an opportunity. A few weeks later, Amy and I were enjoying a quiet dinner at an upscale restaurant with Nick and Cam. As I savored a glass of wine, I noticed familiar faces across the room, Emily and her husband, Jimmy, seated with another couple. Amy spotted them too and excused herself to go to the powder room with Cam. Their path took them directly past Emily's table. I watched from a distance as Emily froze, her face draining of color. She covered her mouth in shock as Amy stopped to greet her, pointing toward me with a smug smile. Whatever Amy said made Cam laugh, leaving Emily visibly flustered. She rushed out of the restaurant, dragging Jimmy behind her. When Amy and Cam returned to the table, I couldn't help but smile. Whatever they'd said had clearly struck a nerve. The satisfaction of that small victory tasted just as sweet as the wine in my hand. Curious about what had transpired, I asked Amy what she'd said to Emily at the restaurant. With a sly grin, she explained, "After Cam said hi, Emily asked who I was with. I smiled and replied, 'Oh, I'm with him.'" Amy laughed at the memory, clearly enjoying the moment. Meanwhile, the fallout from the earlier attack on me had come to a conclusion. Of the 3 men involved, one was sentenced to 15 years for orchestrating the assault, while another, a first-time offender, received 5 years. The third had been acquitted after evidence showed he hadn't actively participated. Justice had been served, and I could finally move on. Before Amy and I left for our honeymoon, Nick and Cam drove us to the airport. As we said our goodbyes, I handed Nick an envelope. "Don't open this until we've taken off," I told him. Inside was the deed to my old house, a wedding gift for his son, Eric. I had kept this a secret from everyone except Eric, knowing how much stability would mean to a newlywed couple. After returning home and settling in, I called Pat to invite her and her partner to dinner that Friday. I didn't mention it to Amy, wanting to surprise her. When Friday arrived, the 4 of us enjoyed a lively evening filled with laughter, great food, and stories of the past year. Amy and I eventually took a proper honeymoon, a 2-week sailing trip through the Caribbean. The days were filled with excursions to stunning beaches, and the evenings brought lively dances under the stars. By the time we returned home, we were completely exhausted but thoroughly rejuvenated. My business was thriving, with a dedicated troubleshooting team in place to handle any program or hardware issues, allowing me to slow down and savor life while quietly planning the next steps in my quest for justice. 9 months later, Amy and I welcomed our son, James, into the world, and just a year after that, our daughter, Sarah, joined our growing family. We moved into a larger house to accommodate our expanding household but stayed close to our safe and supportive community. 2 months after Sarah's birth, I received a call from Nick. "You won't believe this," he began. "Jimmy kicked Emily out. He used their prenup to keep the kids he adopted, leaving her with absolutely nothing." The news stunned me. Emily had played her cards poorly, and the consequences were catching up to her. Amy called Emily's parents to see if they had any information about her whereabouts, but her father's response was cold. "Don't contact us again," he said flatly, mentioning only that he had wired her a couple of $1,000s to get by. It seemed Emily was now facing the sting of betrayal and isolation that she had inflicted on so many others. Phase 1 of my plan was complete. I wasn't finished yet, but seeing her unravel was gratifying. Her old email account was still active, so I sent her the private investigator's report I had commissioned on Jimmy, detailing all his betrayals. Amy watched me with a mix of concern and amusement as I hit send. "You're enjoying this a little too much," she teased. "Maybe," I replied with a shrug, "but she's finally feeling the consequences of her choices. I just gave her the truth she's been avoiding." I checked into a modest motel with little more than the clothes on my back, my laptop in the car, and a couple of $1,000s in my bank account. Emily sat across from us, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She hesitated before speaking, her voice trembling. "No one will talk to me anymore, not after everything I did to you," she admitted, her gaze dropping to the table. "My family's disowned me. When I called Jimmy's father, Barry, to ask for help, he told me they didn't need me now that they had an heir to the family fortune." Her words trailed off as she wiped at her cheeks. "I begged my dad to talk to me, and he finally agreed, but only to tell me I wasn't welcome. He wired me a few $1,000s and said never to contact him again." Emily glanced up at Amy, desperation etched into her features. "I had nowhere else to go." Amy looked at me, her expression softening. After a brief pause, she said, "Maybe we should let her stay in the guest room for now, at least until we figure out other options. I'll take her shopping for basics tomorrow." Reluctantly, I nodded. Emily seemed genuinely defeated, and though I still carried resentment, I couldn't bring myself to turn her away completely. Emily headed back upstairs to rest, and when she came down later that evening, she looked more composed. We explained the plan for the next few days, and she broke down into tears again, thanking us profusely. The next morning, Emily surprised us by preparing breakfast, coffee and buttered toast. She joined us at the table, her gratitude evident in her expression. "Dan, Amy. I'm so lucky. I didn't expect this kind of kindness after everything I've done." Amy and I exchanged a look but said nothing. Later that day, Amy took Emily shopping for essentials, while I stayed behind to organize the delivery of furniture and other items for the new house. When the deliveries arrived, the girls returned and found places for everything, working like clockwork to make the space feel more like home. In the end, we decided to support Emily financially, giving her a credit card with a $1,000 monthly limit and $10,000 for her checking account to help her get back on her feet. That evening, after more hugs and tears, we all went to bed. As Amy and I lay in bed, she turned to me and said, "I'm glad you didn't kick Emily when she was already down." I sighed. "I just hope she's learned her lesson and treats her next partner better." The next morning, I resumed working on my plans for legal retribution. I wasn't seeking financial gain for myself, but I began seriously considering a $10 million claim against Jimmy and XYZ Advertising for alienation of affection. Although I had signed a non-disclosure agreement with XYZ during the divorce proceedings, agreeing to keep their name out of it, the temptation to break the NDA and repay the money was strong. I handed Brian the DNA reports confirming that Troy Simmons was the biological father of Emily's children. This revelation meant that neither Jimmy nor I had any legal claim to them, and the adoption Jimmy had orchestrated was entirely invalid. Armed with this evidence, Emily could now fight to reclaim her children. "This isn't just about custody," I clarified to Brian. "The adoption itself is void, and will prove it. Emily deserves to get her children back." Brian nodded. "We'll demand their immediate return from the Prescott residence at 218 Fifth. Then, we'll take further action." He outlined the plan step by step. File a lawsuit against Troy Simmons for sexual misconduct, alleging that he coerced Emily into an affair to keep her job. Pursue legal action against Jimmy Prescott for manipulating Emily into a relationship that ultimately destroyed her marriage. Sue XYZ Advertising for enabling a toxic work environment, fostering the affair, and failing to address Simmons's abuse of power. Demand public accountability for everyone involved, ensuring Emily's reputation could be restored. Brian assured me that everything would be ready within 2 weeks. Meanwhile, I planned to launch my broader offensive a week later. Leaving his office that day, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Justice was finally within reach. True to form, Jimmy and Barry Prescott fought tooth and nail in court, leveraging their influence to delay proceedings. But Brian pressed forward, unyielding, and methodically dismantled their defense. A week later, as planned, I sent the compiled evidence to every major media outlet. The response was immediate. Reporters swarmed the courthouse and camped outside the homes of everyone implicated. The scandal spread like wildfire, and XYZ Advertising's clients began threatening to sever ties. The company, desperate to salvage its reputation, fired Troy Simmons without severance. The Prescotts didn't fare much better. Under immense pressure, both Jimmy and Barry stepped down from their positions, though the legal battle over their misconduct was far from over. Behind the scenes, I executed the final steps of my plan. Jimmy's missing funds, a significant amount I had maneuvered him into taking, surfaced during the investigation, sealing his fate. To ensure he faced the full consequences, I bribed a prison allocator to place Jimmy in the same cell as a particularly dangerous inmate. His time behind bars would be far from pleasant. Meanwhile, Emily's life began to stabilize. With the legal battle over custody resolved, she moved into a larger home and focused on rebuilding. She retook her bar exams and was hired at the same law firm as my sister, Pat. Though Emily and I didn't interact much socially, we occasionally helped each other with babysitting. As far as I knew, Emily hadn't dated anyone since the debacle. Her priorities had shifted entirely to her career and children, and for that, I couldn't fault her.